In this lesson, we're going to take a look at text animators in After Effects and show how you can create interesting typographic animations animating the individual letters within a text layer. So we'll go through a few different examples here. First, we'll learn how to do simple transform animations with the individual letters in a text layer. Then we'll learn how to use the range selectors to create animate in and animate out type of text animations. And then we'll take a look at how to create text on a path, because you're not always going to want to lay out text in just horizontal or vertical lines. We'll see how to put text around shapes. And we'll also take a look at how to animate the source text property to create title sequences. All right, so for these demonstrations, I'm going to be working strictly in 2D. I will do a 3D text demonstration in a separate lesson. So these are all just two-dimensional typographic examples, but of course a lot of this stuff can be done in 3D as well. Now I'm going to start with a new project, and I don't have any assets to import. I'm just going to create stuff directly inside of After Effects. I'll start by making a new composition. I'm going to call it Text Example 1. And for these demonstrations, I'll use my HDTV 720 29.97 frames a second, just to keep the frame size smaller. 10-second duration will be fine. I'll hit OK. All right, now to create a text layer, we know how to do that. We just take the Type tool, and we can click anywhere to create a text layer and then type in our text. But I want to show a couple pointers here as we get started when it comes to creating text layers. I'm going to delete that one. And I want to show that if you know that your text needs to be centered in the frame, you can choose Layer, New, Text, and create your text layer that way. So that way your text layer will be centered in the frame. Now it's only going to be centered in the frame, of course, if your paragraph alignment is set to center. If your paragraph alignment is set to align left or align right, then it's not going to be centered. Notice the anchor point of the text layer is, but the text is aligned to whichever side of that anchor point, or centered to the anchor point, depending on your paragraph alignment. Now, another thing I want to point out about creating text layers is that this type of text layer, the kind of text layer you get when you just single click with the Type tool or choose Layer, New Text, is called point text, and that's because the text is aligned around that individual point. But there's another way of using the Type tool. If I delete that layer, and instead of clicking, if I click and drag to create a text layer, that creates what's called a paragraph block. And what happens then is your text will automatically stay confined to within the block. And then if you resize the block, you can see that the text dynamically resizes. Okay, so this is good if you have whole paragraphs of text. So for example, if I made this text smaller, and let me copy and paste it a few times to fill the block there. And when we have paragraph text in a block, like I said, we can resize the paragraph block, but we can also use the justify options as well as the indentation and margin options here in the paragraph panel. So the stuff that's grayed out when you're using point text becomes available. This one here, justify with last line aligned left, justify with last line aligned center, and so on. Now, actually, let me maybe do a better example here. Oops, I'm going to select all of that. Let me do a better example. And I'll put a couple spaces and copy and paste that a few times. There we go. And just to illustrate the difference here, so justify with the last line aligned left, justify with the last line aligned center, and justify with the last line aligned right, or justify all, which, kind of like the columns in a newspaper, spreads all the letters out to fill the width. Okay, so that's paragraph text, right? So if you click and drag with the type tool. Now it is worth noting here there is not only a horizontal type tool, but a vertical type tool. And if you single click with that, you will get point text that'll, is laid out vertically. If you click and drag with that, you will get paragraph text that is laid out vertically. Okay, so both the horizontal type tool and the vertical type tool have that functionality to be able to create point text and paragraph text. Okay, so for this first example though, I'm just going to create horizontal text. I'm going to type in my title. And to get out of that typing mode, I'll just switch back to the arrow tool. Now, if you decide you need your text layer to be centered in the frame after you've created it, you can hit P for position, right-click on the word position, and choose Reset. That will get your text layer back to center, and then you can use your paragraph alignment, of course, to center it. Now, I'll go ahead and make my font size a little bigger here. So in the character panel or the properties panel, you have your basic type styling options, your font size, your leading or line spacing, your kerning, which is grayed out right now, your tracking, which is your horizontal spacing, that's the overall spacing. Kerning is if you have a line break, right? If you have a line break in your text, you can use the leading option here to control the vertical spacing. Okay, but if you don't have any line breaks in your text, then obviously that doesn't really matter. Okay, and then again, the tracking is the overall horizontal spacing. Now, kerning, which is grayed out right now, is the individual spacing between two letters. And to use that, you have to take the type tool, put the type insertion point between the two letters, and then you can use the kerning to kern the two individual letters. So those are some of your main, type styling options here. You've also got some scale options and some baseline shift option here, which is useful to know about. If you need to raise or lower an individual letter, you can use baseline shift to do that. And a few other things there as well. You have, let's see, we've got a fake bold option if you want to make your text even bolder, or fake italic, faux italic. You have an all caps option, which is useful if you didn't type it in all caps and then you decide you want it to be all caps. Small caps, same thing, but with the front letters larger. And then you also have a superscript and subscript option there for, setting a character to be either superscript or subscript. Okay, pretty straightforward, but those are also fairly limiting. There's not a lot really you can do in just the character panel alone, like if you want to be able to rotate letters or you want to be able to skew individual letters and things like that. And that's where text animator groups are going to come in. So for example here, let's say I wanted to rotate just the letter Y in this text object. Well, I can't do that in the character panel. And if I go to my layer and go to my layer transform group, of course, if I rotate there, it's going to rotate the entire layer and everything that's on it. And I just want to rotate the one individual letter. So this is where text animators come in. To add a text animator with the property that we need, we click on our text group, we go to our animate menu, and we choose the property that we want to add. So in this case, I'll add rotation. So in the text group, that creates a group called Animator1, and it adds a rotation property. And if I rotate that rotation, you'll see that the letters themselves rotate. So pretty big difference there between rotating the layer. So keep in mind your transform group is the entire layer and everything that's on it, versus the text animator, which is just the letters on the layer. Now, what if I just want to rotate the one individual letter? That's what the range selector is for. The range selectors are these lines that you see on the left and right edge of the text object. If you switch to your arrow tool, you can click on those and drag them to narrow in on the letter or group of letters that you want the property to affect. See, so if I set the range selector around just that one letter, I can get it to rotate just the one letter. Now you can also open up the range selector group and you can animate, or, well, I'll show that in the next example, how to animate these properties, but you can scrub these properties to set them as well. And one thing I want to point out about the range selector properties, by default there, they are a percentage of the width of that line of text. But if you go to this advanced group, the very first option there is a units option. And you have the option here of changing it to index numbers, which can be more precise than percentage if you're trying to be very precise with which letter or group of letters you are selecting. You can set it to index and then put in the number there. So the start point here is after the first letter and the end point is after the second letter. Now, if we just want to animate the transform values for individual letters, we don't need to do anything really with the range selector. We can just animate that property itself, right? We can animate that rotation just like we were rotating, the entire layer. So if I wanted that letter to rotate, I could, set rotation keyframes and so on. Okay. Now let's say I wanted the letter T to animate. And here's a tip. If you know which letter you want to animate beforehand, you can use the type tool to highlight that letter, then go to your animate pop-up menu and choose the property you want to add. So I'll do position here for the letter T. That creates a new animator group with the position property, and it automatically set the range selector for me, so I didn't have to do it. See, so that because I selected the letter first, it automatically set the range selector around that letter. So I'll go ahead and set some keyframes here for that. Have the letter T drop down in off the top. Maybe I have it drop a little below and then kind of pop back up. So I've got the letter Y wiggling, I've got the letter T dropping down and popping back up. Okay, so now I've got two animator groups within my text group, one for each of those letters. And we can have as many animator groups on a layer as we want. So let's say, for example, I wanted to do something with the letter E. I could select the letter E, go back to the animate pop-up menu, add the property that I want to animate for that letter. So in this case, maybe I'll do scale and set some scale keyframes. And maybe I'll have that letter scale up. Maybe I'll have it scale big and then scale back down. So you can see the letter E scales up. Now notice that in this case, it scales up from the baseline or bottom edge of the letter. If I want to change that, I would select that animator group. And notice that to the right of each animator group, there's an add menu. You can add additional properties or selectors to your group. So if I add an anchor point property, for example, here, and scrub the anchor point value so I can put the E so it's centered on its anchor point, that, of course, is going to affect how it scales, right? So it scales from the center now instead of from the bottom baseline. But of course that moved it below the baseline of the other text. So I might add a position property there as well to lift the whole thing back up. Okay, so you can add as many properties to an animator group as you want. Like maybe I want to add a rotation animation to that same letter. So as the letter E, scales up, it also spins. So maybe I set a rotation keyframe there, have it do, a couple revolutions, And so now that letter E scales and spins up. Now another tip, when you're adding lots of animator groups to animate the individual letters, things can get confusing here in your timeline. If you click on an animator group and type return, you can give it a descriptive name. So I would definitely do that. Maybe I call this one letter Y animation. Maybe I call this one letter T animation. And maybe I call this one letter E animation. All right, so you can have as many animator groups as you need to animate the letters as needed. Now, let's say, for example, I wanted to have the same exact animation I just did on the letter E on the letter M over here on the other side. Could I do that without having to redo everything? Yeah, of course. If I go to that animator group and I add another range selector, because remember, the range selector controls what letter or group of letters are being affected by that group, by the properties within that group. Well, in this case, though, the M and the E are not next to each other. So I would need to add another range selector within that group and then set that range selector. Whoops, make sure I use the arrow tool and make sure I have the range selector selected here and narrow it in just on the letter M. There we go. So now I've got one range selector set around the letter M. I've got one set around the letter E. So that same group of properties, the anchor point, position, scale, and rotation that I put in that group are affecting both of those letters. So you can have as many range selectors within an animator group as you need as well. Now, at any point, if you want to delete any of this stuff, of course, you can just click on it, hit delete. And there's also on-off switches to the left of each group if you want to turn off that animation. So pretty flexible system here for being able to animate the individual letters. So in this example here, we were showing how to animate the individual letters. In the next example, though, I'm going to show how to animate the range selectors to create animate in and animate out type of effects. All right, so that was the first example.